I'm not sure if this is working. Okay, here we go. All right, I'm Emily Graf, and here today to show you how to use some of these fabulous felting supplies to make a felted holiday gnome. Even do one next Halloween. So whatever your ideas and however you want to do it, this is a great first felting project because we're going to learn a bunch of different techniques. And the other thing that's great about it is if it's not perfect, your gnome is not going to mind. So if you have a little hole in the hat or it's a little thin here and there, none of that matters. So I have my place set up here. I have a towel to catch any extra water, a little bit of bubble wrap, everything else pushed over to the side. And I want to keep my wool far enough to the side that it's not going to accidentally get wet before I want it to. So Susan, can you focus that like closer up on the workspace now instead of on me? So the first thing that we're going to start with is making the body of the gnome. And for this, I am using some non-felting wool. That means that it's been treated. No matter what I did to it, this wouldn't felt inside of the body. And the reason that I do that is because I'm going to be using my felting needles later to felt onto it. And if I was to make this solid wool, it would be really hard to felt into it. So take a little bit of your non-felted wool, and you probably have more there than you need. You're going to roll it into a tight little burrito shape. Like that. We'll set that off to the side. You will not need to use the rest of this wool. So if you use it all up, you're going to have a little bigger gnome, but probably about three quarters of it. Then we're going to take our felting wool. I get this from Susan's Fiber Shop, and the reason I'm using it for our gnome body today is because it felts so quickly and so easily. But we don't want it all in one big clump here. First of all, I'm going to have you peel off just a little extra strip and set that off to the side, again, where it's not going to get wet. The rest of it, you're going to peel into as many thin sheets as you can get it into. Sometimes wool comes in long strips of roving. This wool comes in a bat, kind of like you would use on the inside of a quilt. I like that, again, because it's going to felt very quickly. So now that I have my pieces laid out here, I have a little bit stashed off to the side. We're going to use that later. I am going to dip this non-felting wool into my soapy water, and I'm going to start rolling it into my thin sheets of the felt wool batting. Something that is really important about wet felting is that you want to change directions every time. And having the wool layers go in all different directions, again, is going to help it felt much more quickly. So I changed directions there. I'm just tucking the extra sides around. I have a little extra and some set off to the side, so I'm going to keep adding layers even though I can't see any of the inside batting anymore. And we'll just use this up, going a different direction every time. All right, so it's kind of loose. It's going to get kind of soppy when we get it wet. You can dip it quickly into your water. You can sprinkle water on it. This is a little plant waterer. You can use a sponge or a towel to squeeze water over it, but it doesn't matter. Let's say you don't have any of that handy. We can even just give it a quick little dip. And now we have our soppy mess here. I'm going to put a little hand soap into my hands. And the hand soap is what makes the fibers, the microscopic fibers, start to open so that they can felt together. I always use hand soap, and I usually use Method hand soap from Target because it doesn't bother my hands at all. You can use dish soap. You can use olive oil soap. There's lots of different choices. So kind of made my hands soapy. And I'm going to lift this up and I'm going to start moving it around in my hand so gently. I tell people who are from up north where we are that it's like making a snowball. Maybe some of you have never made a snowball before, but if you have, you know that if you push right away, the snow just all flops. So I am just barely moving this around in my hands. I'm not worrying about the shape. I'm just moving it around. I still have kind of a squishy mess, but I can also feel that already there is sort of a skin that has felted on the top. All wool does not felt this quickly, but this great stuff that Susan has is just so fast. Now I'm going to start adding just a little more pressure, and notice I've got my thumbs there on the side. And I'm going to keep adding pressure as I go. So I was showing you very slowly. You don't need to go that slow. And you can kind of feel the gnome body here start to shrink, getting smaller. I can tell now that even if I tried to take it apart, I couldn't. So it is felted. And by the way, if you're somebody who's done felting before, this is a lot of soap. And you don't usually use this much soap. But for this kind of project, it's just quick and easy. And it's going to felt no matter how much soap you have in there. Now, at this point, you can decide how far you want to go. The gnome's not going to fall apart. That's going to stick together. You can rub it on your bubble wrap a little bit. That just is a different way of felting it. You can just keep adding more and more pressure. Now, if you keep felting, it's really going to start to shrink a lot. But it's still squishy because none of the inside wool is felting. And I want to make sure I keep it a little bit squishy. So I'm going to dip this into my, sorry, didn't warn you. I'm going to dip this into my clean water here just to get most of the soap out. And I will tell you that if I was felting anything other than a Christmas ornament or a gnome, I would be a lot more careful about getting all the soap out. But again, for this gnome, I'm not going to worry about it too much, and I don't have the patience to spend tons of time on a decoration for my plant. If I was making something for a person, I'd get every last little bit of soap out. I'm going to press this in the towel to get a lot of my water out. It's going to lose its shape a little bit because of that non-felting wool on the inside. So even though it's kind of dry now, I'm just going to roll it in my hands. And I'm making the top very pointy. The bottom, you can either flatten out with your hands or with the bubble wrap, or you can leave it round. That's totally up to you. And then I'm going to put this over to the side to dry. This is going to take the longest to dry, so this is one of the reasons I did this first. But that's our gnome body basically ready to go. So we used a hand felting technique there, and that hand felting technique was sort of like sculpting clay a little bit. The next technique we're going to use is a layout with a pattern. And I lost my pattern, so I've got to grab this. Sorry. The pattern is the tiny piece of bubble wrap that you have in there that's shaped like this. You can make patterns out of a lot of different materials, but the way that I always make patterns is I have this bubble wrap that is flat on both sides. It's kind of just thickness, and it rolls up really nicely, which you'll see why that's important in just a second. So we're going to start out the gnome hat flat and turn it into more of a hat shape afterwards. Using another batch from Susan's here. It's a different kind of wool. It's a little bit slower felting, but it comes in great colors. So we've got our red, but I'm going to peel a tiny bit off to the side We probably won't even use that, but it's always good to have a little bit of that color left if you need some extra. And I'm going to peel everything else into as thin of layers as I can get and pile them just off to the side. If you want, you can kind of split it into two piles so that you have about 3/4 of it in one pile and 1/4 of it in the other pile. And then I'm going to start laying this out for my gnome hat. Now I have to tell you again, if I was making a hat for a person, I wouldn't use this bat. I would use merino roving. It would be much softer. It would take much longer to make, but it would be more comfortable to wear. But since the gnomes don't complain about how itchy their hat is, we're going to go for speed instead. Now, thinking about what size my pattern is, I'm going to lay out a couple thin layers of this bat in roughly the size of the pattern. Obviously, it doesn't need to be perfect, and I have some thinner spots and some thicker spots. For a person's hat, that might make a difference. For our gnome hat, it doesn't matter so much. But with batting, we're going horizontally. So I'm going to lay down a second layer now with them going in a vertical direction. That's going to take care of a lot of the unevenness. And so now I've used up about 3/4 of my red wool on one side. I have a little bit just in case, and then I have my other 1/4 over here. This now I want to get wet. Again, if you don't have anything to sprinkle the water with easily, you can use the rest of your non-felting wool like a sponge and just drip water on it. It gets a little messy if there's too much water, so you don't want to add too much, but I can see that there's enough water in there. Whenever I touch the wool, I'm going to put a little soap on my fingers, and that keeps the wool from sticking to my hands. And then I'm going to place my pattern on the top. Now this is going to be the bottom of the hat. I'm not going to worry about that at all. I'm just going to leave it coming off the edge. But the sides here, I'm going to gently pick up, and they're even sticking together just from getting wet already. And I'm going to fold them over the side. It's pretty fragile now, so I'm just going to do that really gently. I'm not going to pull or stretch. And way up here at the point of the hat, you can see that my extra wool here wraps over, but I still have too much. So I'm going to pick up my pattern and wrap it under too. Now I'm going to do the other side. Again, at the point, I have way too much, so I'm just going to keep wrapping it around and pulling up my point at the top. Now you can see why I didn't need to save a whole half of the wool for this side of the hat. Now that I've wrapped it around, I really just need to go over the areas here that don't have any wool. Oops. I should stick to the same directions. So I'm going to go vertically, and then I'll lay down a little horizontal, or horizontal then vertical, whichever, depends how you're looking at it, I guess. Now I want to wrap these around, so gently I'm going to flip the hat over and make sure that all my little edges get tucked in there. Now at this point, if you're like me, you probably have too much water in there, because I always end up putting in too much water. So again, I'm going to put a little soap on so I don't stick to it, and I can squeeze out a little of that water because it just doesn't need to be quite that wet. All right, so now we're going to do a different felting technique. The first one we did in our hands. This one we are going to do by rolling it up and rolling it in the towel. I'm going to fold the bubble wrap over like this and bring it down to the edge of my towel. Again, if I was felting a person's hat or something bigger than this, I would want to be really careful, and I would roll it up just right. I would tie it so that it didn't slip, but we're going to go for fast here. I have a little edge of the towel over to be sort of like core of my roll. And I'm not rolling it tightly, but snugly, I would say. And now I'm going to roll it with my hands somewhere between 30 and 50 times. And I'm hardly putting any pressure. The weight of my hands is all that I'm doing to push down. So I don't know, I'm on about 10 here. If I feel my towel start to slip, you can roll it up again, but only if it's really slipping a lot. Once I unroll this, not much will have happened yet, but again, just the very beginning of that skin will start to form on the outside. Carefully peel back my package. If any of your wool is sticking to your bubble wrap at this point, it means that you could add a little bit more water or a little bit more soap. So I flattened it out here. I can feel it has just started to felt, but I could still tear these fibers apart. I'm going to flip it over now, and I'm going to do the same thing from the other direction. Oh, I forgot my towel here. When you're doing this rolling method here, you can get some wrinkles in there, and it doesn't all felt evenly, especially with a bigger project. So switching directions helps keep the felting even and the wrinkles out. I'm adding just a little more pressure this time. And something, your whole workstation set up and everything is slipping around a little too much. If you get your towel a little bit wet, everything will stay in place better. Sorry, your towel. All right, so I'm going to open up my package, and I'm going to flip it again. Every single time I'm going to flip it, but this time I'm also going to change directions. So now I'm rolling it up and down. And again, adding a little more pressure. I'm even going to stand up this time, and pulling and pushing a little bit. I stopped at 16 because I was coming undone a little bit. So I'm going to finish up. And again, we're going between 50 and 30 times. And now we've gone 3 of the 4 directions. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to do one more direction. And this time I'm really going to put a lot of pressure on it as I roll. All right. Okay, so taking a look here, I have a flat triangle. The bottom has felted together. I can feel my pattern in there, and the edges are starting to look a little bit ragged. So I'm going to put, again, tiny bit of soap on my hands and just push back and forth on the bubble wrap, and it's going to smooth out those edges. All right, so I want to really change the direction that I'm felting this in now. I want it to squish out the other direction. So I've got to take out my pattern for that. I'm going to cut off the bottom. And I can see my pattern. And pull. Now just to check to see if this is felting well enough, I'm going to pinch and pull. If I start pulling and feel like I'm going to get a hole in there, I know that I should probably tuck this back in and roll it some more. But I can actually pull. It's not fully felted and it hasn't shrunk or folded all, but it has a really good start to it. So I'm going to switch the direction. This is how we had the pattern in. I'm going to make sure I don't get those creases along the edge by pushing it this way. The other thing that you can do to make it felt a little more quickly is add another spritz of warm water, and also to roll it up more tightly. So this time I'm going to leave the towel out and just roll the towel around the whole package. And then also adding pressure. If you have peaked and you have a pretty good start, but you've noticed that you're getting somewhere that you didn't have enough fibers, you can add a little of the extra fibers that you saved of the red where the hole is, add water and soap, but you kind of have to start the rolling over again if you do that. Now this is going to look like a mess here. If I hadn't felted it enough when I did this step, then I will have wrecked my hat, but since it was already started, I still have the opening in there like that. So now what we want to do is basically just felt this as fast as possible. Again, knowing that our gnome doesn't care about tiny little things. So I'm going to add soapy water. You can kind of roll it in your hands a little bit and squeeze it a little bit. Again, I'm going to check pretty often to make sure that I'm not felting my hat closed, that I still have an opening. And let's just take a look at this so we can see what happens during the felting process. Now it reaches about 2/3 of the bubble wrap. So we're going to just keep rolling it and then we'll check to see if it's shrinking. Once it starts to shrink, we'll know that it's felted and it's starting to fold together. If you seem like you have any uneven felting, you can concentrate on one area. Again, way too much soap because I just always do. Now when you start getting closer to being done and you want the top of your hat to look nice, you can roll that back and forth like you're making a Play-Doh worm almost in your hands. But I don't want to get that felted too much just yet. I'm mostly working on the bottom part of the hat. You can also make use of your bubble wrap again, putting your hands inside the tiny little hat. All right. Here's another way to work pretty quickly is to skip the bubble wrap altogether and just wrap it in your towel now. And do some rolling. If you're doing a few rounds of rolling that way, make sure that you're switching directions. Okay. So I can tell right in front of me that this has started to shrink a little bit, and it's shrunk more this direction too, because as I'm felting back and forth, it sort of elongates a little bit. And now is the time that I'm going to rinse it and get most of the water out. You can rinse it under the sink or in a bucket of mostly not soapy water. All right, and now is probably the hardest part about making the gnome. And that is to put the wire inside the hat so we can give it a fun little top. You've got 2 wires in your kit, and if one is a little shorter than the other, use the shorter one for this. And I'm going to start feeding it up here. Now, depending on how felted I got up here, it's going to go through either really easily, or you're going to have to poke it through and try to get it all the way up to the top. I got pretty close there, so I'm going to stop before I accidentally go through. If you poked right through the side of your hat and you really don't like that there's a hole there, even though the gnome doesn't care, you can take a little bit of your wool and wrap that around the end and cover up that hole. And we're going to roll the top of the hat just a little bit more now to get a nice up at the very top. I have my wire in there. I'm going to turn this way. My water is going to hold down the end of my bubble wrap. And I'm just going to fold this over my bubble wrap. And roll it down through the bubble wrap. I'm going to put it back up and roll again. I'm going to do that about 10 times. And then I'm going to switch directions and do it about 10 times that way. Then as much water out as you can, and you're going to shape your hat while it's still damp. It's going to stay the way that it dries. So I'm folding up the inside to give it a nice little bottom edge there. And my favorite way to shape these is just a little crick in the top. You can do this with your hands, but it is a little neater if you're using pliers. And I'm just going to get it to the shape that I like. If you wanted to do a rounded top instead of the back and forth, it works really well to use a broom handle or something like that and just wrap it around the broom handle. And then, yeah, we can just set that aside to dry. So now I have my gnome here, my gnome body, and my gnome hat. Sure. I'm going to show you how with a dowel or a gnome hat, this is a gnome that is already dried and finished, but if you kind of hold there and wrap around, you can do a nice shape like that too. So you can do all sorts of fun stuff with the hat. All right. So if you're watching this live, you can probably watch the rest and remember to put it together, but you really want to wait for your 2 pieces to be dry before we do the construction. So I'm going to move over with 2 pieces that I've already dried so that I can show you the construction, and then you can go back and do yours when it's dry. So can we move to that little spot over there?
Okay.
Okay, so here I have my gnome, my dry gnome body, and my dry gnome hat right there. Now, I'm going to be using even another sort of felting, which is called needle felting. You have a block in your kit of foam and a needle. Needles break really easily and they are really sharp. All right, so if you break your needle or if you are doing this with younger kids and the needles just feel a little too sharp. You can also do every single part of this with glue, and I like this fast grab craft glue. Works really well and really quickly. But I'm going to show you how to do it with the needles. I'll tell you where I would add the glue. Okay, so we're going to get the beard ready to make, and this is my favorite part of the gnome. These are called sheep locks here, and these are from Susan's Teeswater sheep, and they're awesome. So what you're going to do is separate the locks. You can tell the bottom of the lock because it has kind of a neat little curl. Sometimes it's a little yellowed, and you can pull it apart from the other locks and start laying them out. And you're going to have a little choice here of how you want the beard of your gnome to look. It could be really neat, or it could be kind of messy. Some of the locks are tinier and really curled up. I tend to put those in the front. So my beard is going to look like this. And I'm going to take the scissors and just cut it so it's about 2 inches high. Now, if you want your beard on your gnome to be thicker, you can take some of these top pieces and put them in the back, and that will sort of build it up there. But however messy this looks at this point, it's going to look really cute when it's on your gnome. So here, if I was using glue, I'll just show you that too. I would just about halfway up on the cone of the gnome body, I would put a few dabs of glue. Doesn't take very much. Sorry. And then lay the beard down and hold it. With the needles, I'm going to just start to jab the top of the locks down into the gnome body. If you pull sideways on the needle at all, that's how they break pretty easily. So just in and out, and they'll last a really long time. If you get more confident, you can go a little faster. You just want to make sure that you are always keeping your fingers out of the way. It hurts really bad if you poke yourself with a felting needle. I lost one of my locks, so I just poke it in there. All right, so you can give it a little haircut if you want, or you can leave it messy. And the next thing that we're going to do is get the nose ready to go. Sorry, I'm not sure what you just hold it up. Oh, yeah. So this is going to just sit off to the side right here. And with this extra gray felting wool, I'm going to take just a little bit of it and put it on my felting block. Poke it just a couple times. And oh, I can already tell I have way too much, so I'm going to start that over with about half. Just a few little pokes in a circle, and then I don't want to pull anything with my felting needle because I don't want to break it, but I'm just going to sort of wrap those pieces around, and I'm just going to keep poking them in here. And what I'm making is sort of a needle felted ball here. You can speed up the process a little bit by just pulling all the pieces together, giving it a little roll. This is going to be the gnome nose. So you can make it whatever size you want. You can change the shape a little bit, but I'm just making a little ball here. We're going to give him kind of a big nose. All right, and then that's going to just stay there for a minute. So now I'm going to put the hat on the gnome. Again, we can do this in the crafty way with a little bit of glue. If you any glue at all, you're real hardcore, you can take a little bit of your leftover red wool and tuck it up into the hat, and that is going to help you needle felt the hat on a little more securely. So I'm going to pull the hat down as far as I can get it. Now I did use a little bit of glue, but I'm also going to just go around and do a little needle felting on the edge. And you don't have to use the glue at all. It will hold together even if you're just needle felting. This is one of the reasons we want everything to dry, because it doesn't work very well to needle felt with the wet wool. Okay, so I have my gnome body now. See if I'm in the right place. He's got his beard, his hat on, and the last thing that I'm going to do is add his nose. So I've got the nose here, and the reason I add this last is because once you put the nose on, it's a little bit hard to get the hat down over the nose. So instead, I'm going to tuck the hat, or excuse me, tuck the nose up under the hat. And then again, I'm just going to needle felt in there. This was a really big nose that I made. All right. So there we have our needle felted gnome ornament. There's a couple different things that you can do with this. If you wanted to make it into a tree ornament, you can just sew right through the hat. What I usually do is I run the thread down and I go through the top of the gnome body. That way, even after it's been hanging there for a couple years, it won't separate from the body. Or if you want to turn this into a plant ornament, you can just take an awl or a sharp scissors, poke a hole in the bottom, and feed the other half of your wire up through the hole. I don't even, whoops, my scissors was not very sharp there. I don't even, I'll try to cut through this a little bit. Glue the wire in. I just let it sit on there. Oh, here we go. Look at that, perfect. All right. There we go. He's barely on there right now, but we're going to leave him for now. So if you have questions, you can go back and watch the YouTube. If you need more supplies, you want to make yourself a giant gnome or 100 gnomes for next year at the holidays, Susan knows all the different things that we used, and she can get that together for you. And she has a couple more kits here as well. And if you had any questions or got stuck with anything, you can message me through my Facebook or website at thesheepishu.com, and I will help you out. Thank you very much.